Hello and welcome. Today I'm taking a deep dive into Journeys into the Unknown. This is written by Richard Palmisano, a paranormal investigator, author, and the founder of the Searcher Group. I'll talk a bit more about that shortly. This is Mysterious Canadian Encounters with the Paranormal. This book was published in 2006. I have done a previous video on it. This is much more of a deep dive into it, and I'm able to do that for a number of reasons. Number one, I was honored to have Richard as a guest on my live stream, September the 19th, 2024. You can view that by clicking up above. The link should also appear in the description box down below. It was wonderful to meet and be able to speak with Richard, talk about his different publications, forming the Searcher Group, which he did when he was only 18 years old. As I say, he began that group in 1979. It is still up and running 45 years later. I'll leave a link to the website down below as well. There is a lot of information to check out there, so I encourage people to go see what Richard has shared. On the About Us link, you will find out more information about Richard, his past careers, his training, his experiences, and his other books. You'll also learn about the team members of the Searcher Group. There's contact information if you would like to reach out to him and learn more about his experiences and his publications. The other two tabs are Hauntings and Paranormal Insight, where you'll find brief articles on different investigations that he's been involved in. His second publication, Journeys into the Unknown, is the only one that I currently have, but I'm definitely looking forward to reading more of his works. I highly recommend for anyone who is serious about being a paranormal investigator or developing more of your skills, reading Journeys into the Unknown. The book is divided into 4 parts. In part 1, Richard shares different ghost stories. Part 2 is about his investigations. On some of them, he has psychics with him. He stresses the importance of having reputable people with you and being able to verify facts. So you're not just taking information based on what they've sensed. You're checking historical records and other information to verify that. Part 3 are his theories, and those, of course, have changed since 2006, which makes sense based on his additional experience, investigations, and research. But they're a great starting point and food for thought, so they're certainly still valuable to read in 2024. Part 4, he finishes with how to actually do an investigation, equipment, different factors, as well as providing some forms that you may want to use or modify for your own investigations. It isn't very thick, but it is definitely packed with a lot of great information. The introduction begins with, you walk up the pathway laden with heavy packs of equipment. It's just turning dark, and the rain is cold on your face. You stop at the front door, putting the packs down, and search for the key. Your mind is racing, trying to remember the layout beyond the door, and more importantly, the location of the nearest light switch. The door arches open, and you stumble in. You freeze as something is moving on the hardwood floor a few feet from where you stand. You can see the light switch in the fading beams of weak sun that filter in through the open door behind you. Beyond the switch, Nothing but blackness and that noise. Now comes the major decision. Go for the switch or back out the door and leave. The stories revolving around this house spiral through your brain, and you know that according to your preliminary investigation, something lurks in there, in the dark beyond that switch, waiting and watching with unknown intentions. You step forward and reach out, flicking on the switch. Dull yellow light invades the shadow, pushing it off into the corners of the hall and surrounding room, making the deeper interior of the house look even more shrouded in pitch darkness. You pick up the packs and place them in the hall, taking out a flashlight and firing a beam deep into the main floor of the house. You proceed inside with caution, looking for light switches, knowing that you're the trespasser, for whatever lingers here lived and died in this house long before you came onto the scene. You hope your research partner will show up soon, but you proceed because that's the commitment you made when you decided to call yourself a paranormal investigator. There are so many important points, and I'm sorry, Noah, but yes, I am folding the cover. Not only does it set the scene of what the individual doing paranormal investigating is feeling and thinking, as you clearly note, they're searching for a key. So this is not about go find an abandoned house, see if there's a broken window or a door or something to get in. This is going to a property with permission to do an investigation. There's also the point that there's still electricity, so you're looking for light switches. For me, another important point were the words preliminary investigation. So you haven't just stumbled onto this place roaming around the countryside. You've gone, you've checked things out, you know about the history of this place, so you've looked into some things. There is a lot that goes into paranormal investigating long before you show up at that front door. It's why I very much recommend reading this book, because the crucial points like that. Be prepared. You've got your pack with your equipment. You have someone else coming to join you. I know there are a number of people out there with channels who do it by themselves. They have their reasons. They don't want to be influenced by other people, what have you. But honestly, in this day and age, going with someone else makes a lot more sense. Not just for personal safety, but because that way you also have someone to verify and validate what you have seen and heard during that experience. And for me, that stands out because it's probably a couple months ago. I really don't watch Nuke very often anymore, but I've recently seen a clip on Nukes. It was someone who came to the city where I live. I have no idea why they went to this location, because there is nothing about it being haunted or anything else. It is abandoned. And obviously the people who entered it, granted it was 10 years ago, but even then, seriously, our police don't even go in there because of the reputation of this building, and it has nothing to do with the paranormal and everything to do with humans in the here and now who are very dangerous for a number of different reasons. So I stress that point because if you're one of the people who are going to locations because they're abandoned, yes, it is the humans you need to worry about more than the spirits. And you really should be doing some of your homework if you're going to locations out of your own area, because you may not know the reputation of those buildings, but the people who live in those locations certainly do. A story that I would like to share from the ghost section for a number of reasons. Number one, this doesn't give a specific location, and again, I think that is something important. I know that it can be frustrating both for authors and investigators, but to maintain the privacy of the people involved and to maintain the structures that people are going to visit, because sadly, and if you've watched some of the paranormal channels, not everyone is respectful when they go. There's property damage. There's just so many reasons that sadly it's best to keep locations private. I do think it's important for investigators to communicate, not necessarily on social media where everyone's privy to it, but to communicate to each other so that they're doing actual research and that the people who are going to these areas are serious about doing research, not producing entertainment type things. Again, just my biased opinion. But the story that I do want to share, because this brings up another point, and I'll talk more about that at the end of this reading. The Cabin in the Woods, Sudbury Region. This begins on page 68. There's a cabin in the woods just northwest of the small northern town of Levack, Ontario, just off Highway 144. The locals believe it was built as a hunting retreat, but no one knows who owned it or when it was built. Even Ed, who at the age of 96 is probably the oldest living relative in town, says the cabin was old when he was a child. He remembers seeing it with his father when they used to hunt rabbits outside of town. His father warned him to never go near it. Ed has many strange stories of the place. I asked him if he'd listened to his father's warning. Ed just laughed. I was a kid. As soon as he told me that, he had my curiosity on high. He stopped laughing and looked at me, now with seriousness. I should have heeded his words. Ed and his friends, Henry and Walter, wandered out there one afternoon to have a look around. They entered the cabin, which was just one large room with a cast iron stove in the center. There were a couple of old tables, a cot, some shelves with old dusty bottles, and on one table tin pans and a cooking pot. Walter found a chewing tobacco tin. They searched the room for anything of interest. The door slammed, startling them. They all turned to look at the door, and Henry started to move towards it, when a black shadow came from the corner of the room and blocked it. Henry jumped back. The shadow was like a black mist in the shape of a large man. They all panicked. Walter was the first to dive out the window on the opposite side of the cabin, and Ed was right behind him. Ed hit the ground running, but Henry didn't come out. They didn't know what to do. They were kids and they were terrified. They stood there yelling for Henry to come out, but he didn't. A few minutes passed and they debated if they should go back in and get Henry or if they should go and get help. They decided to go back in, so they ran around to the front of the cabin and crept up to the front door. They paused there listening, but heard nothing from inside. Ed reached out a trembling hand and grasped the door handle, took a deep breath, and pushed, letting the door swing open and bang against the table inside. They jumped back again. They called for Henry, but there was no answer. Walter inched into the doorway. Ed was so close to him they kept bumping into each other. They entered and looked around, thinking that maybe Henry had escaped, and then they saw him in the far corner, sitting on the floor. They rushed over to him. He was trembling and breathing funny, staring at the door. They grabbed him and pulled him to his feet, yelling at him, but he never spoke a word. They left the cabin and pulled Henry along as they ran back to town. Henry never talked about what happened in that cabin, and he wasn't permitted to chum around with Walter or Ed anymore. Ed thought it was at the end of that summer that Henry and his family moved to Quebec. That was the last he ever saw of him, and whatever happened to him in that cabin remained his secret. My brother and some men were hunting out that way when they came across the cabin, finding it shrouded in a fog that appeared nowhere else. People report strange lights and sounds out there, and strange things move in those woods, things that are best left alone. The funny thing is, if you're brave enough to go out there today, you will not find a single piece of graffiti on that structure. The local kids all know it's there, and no one will ever go out there to do what kids tend to do. A mining company purchased the land about 25 years ago. Security has on occasion driven by and checked the place. I've talked to some of the guys, and they hate going out there. Steve, a security man, said the place is extremely disturbed. Birds and crickets don't make a sound in that part of the woods, and you always feel as if you're being watched. Now, these stories piqued my curiosity, so I drove out to the cabin with a friend who lived in the area. He told me that it was a bad idea for us to go to the cabin. I reserved judgment. We pulled off the road and prepared to walk the rest of the way. It was a beautiful summer day. The sun was high in the sky, and the mercury was pushing 27 degrees Celsius. We entered the woods and walked about 20 minutes. I instinctively knew we had arrived before my friend said anything. The nature sounds had stopped, and the forest had become cold. We stopped and looked at the cabin from a distance for some time. Neither of us spoke. My friend finally broke the silence. You going up there? Yes. Are you coming? No, I'll wait here. So there it was. If I wanted to have a look, I'd be on my own. I walked towards the cabin, and it seemed to be growing colder. I arrived at the door and paused, looking both ways along the face of the structure, then looking back to make sure my friend was still waiting. As I pushed the door, it arched open, and something hit me. It was an overpowering feeling that I needed to leave this place, that I shouldn't be here. I took a step forward into the open doorway, and then turned and walked away back to where my friend stood. He looked at me. So? You're right. This place should be left alone. I told him, looking back at the cabin. I thought he was going to laugh and tell me, I told you so, when the door slammed shut. The sound was loud and startling, and we turned in defense. We headed back to the car, the hot summer sun, and the sound of birds singing. You definitely need to be paying attention when you're going to locations, and as that story demonstrates, when people tell you maybe there are things you shouldn't be going to check out and locations you should leave alone, it's probably better to listen, even if it does pique your curiosity. Part 2 goes on to talk about the investigations. As I've mentioned earlier, Richard does take psychics to some of the investigations. They verify, check out information, go through historical records. He also makes a very important point that although people may have good intentions about sending spirits on, typically it is the benevolent ones who will make contact with humans, and sometimes it isn't always good to send them on their way, because it is those benevolent spirits that are keeping the balance between some of them and the malevolent energies, meaning things don't get out of control. This is why research, knowing what you're doing, is critical. On page 135, in the theories section, Richard mentions about the different things that have developed over time, investigators using psychics. He also makes the point, and having moved on from the modern spiritual movement, and I've talked more about that in my Hoax or Holy Grail episodes with the Fox sisters and Madame Blavatsky. Here Richard says, what came next were those who felt they could earn a living working in the field of parapsychology, turning out book after book on the subject using the old theories without any proof whatsoever. This caused great harm as the scientific community turned its back on the entire subject. The scientific community has never been into hopping on into looking into this, other than people like J.B. Rhine and a few of the others. There has been some money found to do the research, but sadly, and particularly since social media, and you have all of these people running around calling themselves paranormal investigators when they're not. They may be urban explorers, but they're not investigators. The bugaboo is that when you don't clearly say it's for entertainment, it's 2024. When the Society for Psychical Research was formed, I believe it was the 1800s, I can't quite remember when now in Britain, but I know it was a long time ago. And we're no closer to finding answers, partly because, like I say, it's become such a boondoggle of trying to figure out who's seriously trying to find answers and who's just trying to entertain the public and make a living. For people like myself who are trying to find serious answers and understand it, it becomes immensely frustrating. On page 139, Richard talks about the DNA phantom, research that has been done into that. On 140, he also talks about the importance of ions, negative and positive, for people who have salt lamps, which have become very popular over the last few decades. You know, the salt lamp puts out negative ions. It's also what we experience when thunderstorms are coming. That's why a lot of people feel better when a thunderstorm's coming. Richard makes the point that positive ions can cause heavy and oppressed feelings. So when people are talking about literally feeling something or a certain way, they're being accurate. It may be there's extra positive ions in that area for some reason. That's why, as I've said, people turn on their salt lamps to make the room feel lighter and better. The study of ions and static electricity has produced results that can be studied in a lab and reproduced, including hair standing on end, goosebumps, cold spots, and sensations of being touched. Further, there can be various visual phenomena such as glowing balls of light. Static discharge can produce snapping, crackling, and banging noises as well as water from condensation. All these phenomena have been reported in supposed hauntings. So there we have the different experiences people have. They come up quite often in hauntings, whether you've talked to people or read different ghost stories. I was also fascinated on page 150, Richard talks about how is it that a living individual and a spirit meet. So he describes that a spirit is outside of everyday perception. So maybe think of dust bunnies. I mean, we've all seen them when the sun shines and hits them. You don't see them all the time, but they're there. The light just has to be a certain way for you to be able to see them. The example that Richard uses is you're having a dream where a sound around you, maybe a clock radio, goes off, and it comes into your dream instead of you waking up. The synchronicity occurs when the spirit memory perceives a living individual as part of its memory bubble, due to a resemblance or a simple convenience, causing the spirit to come forward to interact and emotions to escalate. It's at this point of interaction that the two realities collide. The living individual becomes terrified, and the spirit, realizing this person is not part of their reality, quickly retreats beyond our perceptions. It also explains why you may have 2 or 3 people in a room and only one person has an experience. Perhaps that person looks more familiar than the others to the spirit that's there. Perhaps they're just more tuned in, or any number of different things. Maybe they have certain abilities, like the psychics, that they can see things differently. So I really appreciated reading and hearing about that. As I mentioned, it's a very fascinating and informative read. Yes, it is from 2006, but the information is just so very relevant. The final thing that I do want to read, and again, this brings up the point of the difference between a paranormal investigator and a paranormal entertainer. Ghost investigations sound like fun. What more could you ask for in the way of excitement? Going off to a reputed haunted house in the dead of night with a few friends. However, true investigative work is just that, work. Yes, that is why the paranormies whining after 11 months, oh, boo-hoo, I can't do YouTube full time, just grates on my nerves. I've never watched them since. I mean, seriously. Richard has been doing this for 45 years. Others on YouTube who have been trying to do serious investigations have been at it for 5 years and longer. Sniveling after 11 months, for people who think it through, just screams grifter from the get-go. And yes, I'm aware they have tons of fans who have more money than sense and gladly throwing it at them, so to each their own. It is long hours of historical research, going to archives and libraries, scanning miles of old newspapers, searching out the history of the house and property, interviewing people, making a preliminary tour to look for rational explanations. Then, when all this is done, there comes the trip to the house for the investigation, which could end up being nothing more than hours of silent boredom with poor results. Another important point that Richard makes, also on page 164, an investigator has to know a little bit about a lot of things. Physics, general science, electronics, human psychology, physiology, history, parapsychology, paranormal theory, photography, how sound works, how light works, investigative techniques, report writing, and the workings of all equipment that you may be using, to name a few. To me, pointing out that paranormal investigation is work and that you need a background in a variety of disciplines just makes sense. If you know how light works, and I mean, I've certainly seen from debunkers like Dan at World of Mr. Gray and The Shape, a lot of what they end up catching on these videos are either different things with photography or editing. And once you start knowing how to look for that, it's so much easier to tell the difference between the entertainment and legitimate trying to find answers channels. And it's why I've gone back to books and doing my research that way versus spending 20 minutes to an hour, depending on the channel and the video, to figure out these people really aren't trying to do anything other than entertain, which is fine. There's a great audience out there for it. Now and again, I'll watch it for the entertainment point, but in terms of trying to find answers, I've gone back to old school books. I may check the occasional website, what have you, but again, even there, you have to ask yourself, who's put up the website? What's the motivation? And how well did they do their own research before sharing the information? That was a deep dive into Journeys into the Unknown. I know I'm looking forward to obtaining some of his other books and checking out where his theories have gone in terms of the developments and his experiences. Let me know in the comments down below if you've read any of Richard's work. Were you able to attend the live stream with him or watch the live stream? Until next time, remember, if you're getting the tingles and the chills, maybe you just need to turn on your salt lamp. Take good care.